Hashtag the medic's oath. The bitter wind cut through the mountain pass like a blade, carrying with it the promise of death. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos pulled her white camouflage hood tighter around her face as she checked her medical supplies for the third time that morning. The thermometer clipped to her tactical vest read -28 degrees Fahrenheit, but she knew the wind chill made it feel much worse. "Santos, you good back there?" called out Sergeant First Class Jake Morrison from the front of their small convoy. His voice carried that forced confidence that experienced soldiers used when they were trying to keep everyone's spirits up in terrible conditions. "All set, Sergeant," Maria replied, adjusting the weight of her medical pack. At 5 feet 4 inches and 130 pounds, she looked small compared to the heavily armed infantry soldiers surrounding her, but her teammates had learned never to judge her by her size. In 3 deployments to Afghanistan, she had earned their respect by keeping them alive when bullets started flying. The convoy consisted of 2 armored vehicles carrying 12 soldiers through the Kunar Province mountains. They were heading to a remote forward operating base that had been cut off for 6 days due to heavy snowfall. The base was running low on medical supplies and had 3 wounded soldiers who needed evacuation to better facilities. Maria Santos had joined the Army 8 years earlier with dreams of becoming a nurse. Growing up in a poor neighborhood in San Antonio, Texas, she had watched her grandmother struggle with diabetes while being unable to afford proper medical care. The military offered her a chance to get medical training while serving her country, and she had seized that opportunity with both hands. But combat medic training had taught her that battlefield medicine was nothing like civilian healthcare. In hospitals, patients came to you on gurneys in sterile environments. In war zones, you crawled through mud and bullets to reach wounded soldiers, performing life-saving procedures while mortars exploded around you. She had learned to work with steady hands even when her heart was racing with adrenaline. The mountains around them rose like frozen giants, their peaks disappearing into gray clouds that promised more snow. The narrow road they traveled had been carved into the mountainside decades earlier, barely wide enough for their vehicles. On one side rose a wall of rock and ice, while the other side dropped away into a valley so deep that the bottom disappeared into shadows. "This weather's getting worse," observed Corporal Danny Kim, the youngest member of their squad at 19 years old. He had been in country for only 2 months and still jumped at every unusual sound. "Think we'll make it to the base before the next storm hits?" "We'll make it," Morrison assured him, though Maria could hear the uncertainty in the sergeant's voice. The weather reports had been inconsistent, and mountain conditions could change rapidly. They had already passed 2 abandoned vehicles that had been stuck in snowdrifts for who knew how long. Maria checked her watch. They had been traveling for 4 hours and should reach the forward operating base in another 2 hours if the roads remained passable. She thought about the wounded soldiers waiting for her arrival. According to the radio communications she had monitored, one soldier had taken shrapnel to his leg during a mortar attack, another had suffered severe frostbite on both feet, and the third had internal injuries from an improvised explosive device blast. Each of those soldiers was someone's son, brother, or father. Each had people back home counting on them to return safely. Maria took that responsibility seriously. She had never lost a patient under her direct care, and she intended to keep that record intact. The radio crackled with static before a voice came through clearly. "Bravo team, this is Mountain Base. How's your progress?" Morrison keyed his microphone. "Mountain Base, this is Bravo team. We're about 2 hours out, weather conditions deteriorating, but still moving forward." "Copy that, Bravo team. Weather service is calling for heavy snow starting around 1400 hours. Visibility might drop to near zero." Maria looked at her watch again. It was almost noon. They needed to reach the base soon or risk being trapped on the mountain road during a blizzard. She had been through enough mountain winters to know that vehicles could disappear completely under snowdrifts in a matter of hours. The convoy rounded a sharp curve, and Morrison held up his hand to signal a halt. Ahead of them, the road was partially blocked by a fallen tree, its snow-covered branches spread across both lanes. The massive pine had probably been weakened by ice and, finally, succumbed to the constant wind. "Looks like we're going to have to clear this manually," Morrison announced over the radio. "Everyone stay alert while we work." The soldiers dismounted from their vehicles, their breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. Maria remained with the vehicles as the others began sawing through the tree branches with small folding saws from their survival gear. The work was slow going in the extreme cold, and she could see that it would take at least 30 minutes to clear enough of the obstruction. As she watched her teammates work, Maria noticed movement on the ridgeline above them. At first, she thought it might be mountain goats or other wildlife, but something about the pattern of movement seemed wrong. She pulled out her binoculars and focused on the rocky outcropping about 400 meters upslope. What she saw made her blood run cold. 3 figures in white winter camouflage were positioned among the rocks, and one of them was clearly holding a long-barreled rifle. Enemy fighters had found the perfect ambush position, with clear fields of fire down onto the road where the convoy was stopped. "Morrison," she called out urgently, trying to keep her voice low while still being heard over the wind. "We've got company on the ridge." The sergeant immediately stopped his sawing and looked in the direction she was pointing. He raised his own binoculars and cursed under his breath. "How many? I count 3, but there could be more. They've got at least 1 sniper rifle." Morrison's tactical mind immediately assessed their situation. The convoy was trapped on a narrow road with no room to maneuver. The enemy held the high ground with excellent cover, while his soldiers were exposed in the open. The fallen tree prevented them from advancing or retreating quickly. "Everyone take cover behind the vehicles," Morrison ordered in a calm voice that belied the danger they were in. "We've got hostile contacts on the ridgeline." The soldiers immediately dropped their saws and moved toward the armored vehicles, but they were too late. The first sniper round cracked through the thin mountain air like a whip, followed immediately by the sharp report of the rifle. Corporal Kim spun around and fell to the ground, clutching his shoulder as blood began seeping through his winter camouflage. Maria's medical training took over instantly. She grabbed her aid bag and sprinted toward the wounded soldier, staying low as more rifle rounds began hitting the road around them. The enemy had waited for the perfect moment to attack, when the soldiers were spread out and focused on clearing the tree. "Kim's hit," she called out as she reached the young corporal. He was conscious but in obvious pain, his face pale from shock and cold. Maria quickly cut away his jacket and shirt to assess the wound. The bullet had passed through the meaty part of his shoulder without hitting bone or major blood vessels, but he was losing blood steadily. "I'm okay," Kim said through gritted teeth, trying to be brave despite his fear and pain. "You're going to be fine," Maria assured him as she applied pressure dressings to both the entry and exit wounds. "But you need to stay down and let me work." More rifle fire erupted from the ridgeline, joined now by the distinctive sound of automatic weapons. The enemy fighters were laying down a steady barrage of fire that forced the American soldiers to keep their heads down. Morrison was trying to coordinate a response using his radio, but their position was becoming increasingly desperate. "Santos, how's Kim?" Morrison shouted over the gunfire. "He's stable, but I need to get him to better cover," Maria replied. The young soldier was lying in the middle of the road, exposed to enemy fire from multiple directions. She needed to move him to safety, but that would mean exposing herself to sniper fire. Without hesitation, Maria grabbed Kim under his arms and began dragging him toward the nearest vehicle. Bullets struck the asphalt around them, sending up small clouds of concrete dust and ice. She could hear the high-pitched whine of rounds passing close to her head, but she focused entirely on reaching cover. A second soldier, Private First Class Tommy Rodriguez, suddenly cried out and stumbled backward. Maria could see that he had been hit in the leg and was having trouble staying on his feet. Now she had 2 wounded soldiers to treat while under heavy enemy fire. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Morrison was trying to call for air support, but the mountain weather was preventing helicopters from reaching their location. The nearest friendly forces were at least an hour away, and the enemy fighters seemed to have unlimited ammunition and excellent shooting positions. Maria reached the vehicle with Kim and immediately began working to stabilize his condition. The bullet wound was clean but needed proper bandaging to prevent infection and further blood loss. She worked with practiced efficiency, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. "Rodriguez is hit too," called out Specialist Mike Chun, who was pinned down behind the second vehicle. "He needs help." Maria looked across the 20 meters of open road that separated her from the second wounded soldier. Enemy fire was concentrated on that area, making it extremely dangerous to attempt a rescue. But Rodriguez was bleeding heavily and would die without immediate medical attention. She made the decision that would define the rest of her life. Grabbing her medical supplies, Maria sprinted across the exposed road while bullets whined around her. She reached Rodriguez just as he collapsed from blood loss, his face gray with shock. The wound in his thigh was much more serious than Kim's shoulder injury. The bullet had nicked his femoral artery, causing massive bleeding that threatened his life within minutes. Maria immediately applied a tourniquet above the wound and began working to control the hemorrhaging. "Stay with me, Rodriguez," she said firmly as the soldier's eyes began to flutter closed. "You're not checking out on my watch." As she worked to save Rodriguez's life, Maria became aware that the enemy fire was intensifying. More fighters had apparently joined the ambush, and they were now firing from multiple positions along the ridgeline. The American soldiers were trapped with no way to advance or retreat, their ammunition running low as they tried to return fire. Morrison crawled over to Maria's position, his face grim with the knowledge that they were in serious trouble. "How are they?" "Kim will be okay, but Rodriguez is critical. I've stopped the major bleeding, but he needs a hospital soon. Air support is grounded due to weather, and reinforcements are hours away," Morrison said quietly so the wounded soldiers couldn't hear. "We're on our own." Maria nodded, understanding the implications. She had trained for situations like this, but the reality of being trapped in an enemy ambush was far more terrifying than any simulation. The enemy fighters held every advantage, and her fellow soldiers were depending on her to keep the wounded alive long enough for rescue to arrive. As she continued treating Rodriguez, Maria noticed that the enemy fire was becoming more accurate. The fighters were adjusting their aim points and beginning to hit closer to the vehicles. Soon their cover would be inadequate, and more soldiers would be wounded or killed. She looked at her medical supplies and realized she had enough equipment to treat perhaps 2 more serious wounds. After that, she would be reduced to using torn clothing and improvised bandages. The thought of losing soldiers due to lack of medical supplies made her stomach clench with fear. The wind was picking up, and snow had begun to fall more heavily. The weather that had been their enemy during the journey was now becoming a factor in their survival. If the snowfall became too heavy, it would provide concealment from the enemy snipers, but also make any potential rescue more difficult. Morrison was coordinating the defense of their position, but Maria could see that several soldiers were running low on ammunition. They had started the mission with a basic load of ammunition, expecting to reach the forward operating base without encountering enemy contact. Now they were engaged in a sustained firefight with an unknown number of enemy fighters. "Santos," Morrison called out during a brief lull in the firing. "I need you to understand something. If this situation gets worse, you might need to pick up a rifle and help us fight." Maria looked at him with surprise. As a medic, she carried only a pistol for self-defense. Her primary role was to treat wounded soldiers, not engage in combat. The Geneva Convention provided some protection for medical personnel, though enemy fighters in this region rarely respected international law. "I'm a medic, not a shooter," she replied, echoing the informal motto of combat medics everywhere. Her hands were trained to heal, not to take lives. "I know," Morrison said gently. "But if it comes down to survival, we might need every rifle we can get." As if to emphasize his point, another burst of enemy fire raked across their position, forcing everyone to press themselves against the vehicles for protection. Maria could hear the distinctive sound of bullets striking armor plating, knowing that their cover was being systematically degraded by the sustained enemy fire. She looked down at Rodriguez, who was unconscious but breathing steadily. Kim was alert and trying to help by spotting enemy positions, despite his wounded shoulder. These soldiers were depending on her to keep them alive, but she was beginning to wonder if medical skills alone would be enough to save them. The snow continued to fall, and the wind howled through the mountain pass with increasing ferocity. Somewhere up on the ridgeline, enemy fighters were planning their next move, probably waiting for the American soldiers to run out of ammunition before launching a final assault. Maria checked her medical supplies one more time, mentally calculating how long she could keep treating wounded soldiers with what she had available. Then, she looked at the spare rifle lying next to one of the vehicles, abandoned when its owner had moved to a different position. For the first time in her military career, she began to consider the possibility that she might need to become something other than a medic to save her patients' lives. Hashtag when healing hands must hold steel. The snowfall had intensified into a full blizzard, creating a white curtain that limited visibility to less than 50 meters. Maria Santos crouched behind the armored vehicle, watching as Rodriguez's breathing became more labored despite her medical interventions. His body was going into shock from blood loss and exposure to the extreme cold. His blood pressure is dropping, she called out to Morrison, who was directing defensive fire from the opposite side of their makeshift position. I've done everything I can with field medicine, but he needs a real hospital. Morrison crawled back to her position, his face streaked with sweat despite the freezing temperature. How long can you keep him stable? Maria checked Rodriguez's pulse and looked at the improvised, for she had started using fluids from her medical kit. Maybe 2 hours if I'm lucky. After that, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Kim, despite his wounded shoulder, had been helping to spot enemy positions through breaks in the snowfall. Sergeant, I'm seeing movement about 300 meters up the slope. Looks like they're trying to flank us from the north. Morrison raised his binoculars and confirmed what Kim had observed. At least 4 fighters moving through the trees. They're trying to get around behind us. He keyed his radio microphone. All stations, be advised we have enemy movement on our north flank. Adjust defensive positions accordingly. The tactical situation was becoming increasingly desperate. The enemy fighters had superior numbers, better positions, and unlimited time to coordinate their attack. The American soldiers were trapped on a narrow road with limited ammunition and no prospect of immediate reinforcement. Maria continued working on Rodriguez, using techniques she had learned in advanced combat medical training. She had managed to stabilize his condition temporarily, but the combination of blood loss, shock, and extreme cold was creating a medical emergency that required resources she simply didn't have in her field kit. Santos, Morrison said quietly, I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. She looked up from her patient, seeing the weight of command in the sergeant's eyes. Morrison was a good leader who cared about his soldiers, and she could see that he was struggling with an impossible decision. What is it? We're down to about 60 rounds per man. The enemy knows we're running low on ammunition, and they're getting more aggressive. When they make their final push, I'm going to need every soldier who can hold a rifle. Maria understood what he was asking. As a medic, she was technically a non-combatant under the rules of warfare, but those rules meant nothing to enemy fighters who targeted medical personnel as a matter of course. She had seen the results of their brutality in previous deployments. I've never fired anything more powerful than my sidearm in combat, she said honestly. I know, but you qualified expert with the M4 rifle in basic training, and you've maintained those qualifications. More importantly, you're the steadiest person under pressure I've ever served with. Maria looked at the spare rifle lying against the vehicle. It was a standard M4 carbine with a telescopic sight, the same weapon she had trained with extensively, but never expected to use in actual combat. Her role had always been to preserve life, not take it. The sound of gunfire erupted from their north flank as the enemy fighters began their flanking maneuver. Specialist Chun and Private Davis were trying to hold that position, but Maria could hear the volume of return fire decreasing as her teammates conserved their remaining ammunition. Contact north. Chin's voice crackled over the radio. Multiple targets moving through the trees. I can see at least 6 fighters. Morrison grabbed his rifle and prepared to reinforce the north side of their position. Santos, Rodriguez, and Kim are as stable as you can make them right now. I need you to make a choice. Maria looked down at her patients. Rodriguez was unconscious, but breathing steadily thanks to her medical intervention. Kim was alert and had even managed to bandage his own wound with her guidance. She had done everything possible with her medical training. But if the enemy overran their position, all of her medical work would be meaningless. The fighters would execute any wounded Americans they found, and probably torture them first. She had seen intelligence reports about what happened to captured American soldiers in this region. The rifle felt heavier than she remembered when she picked it up. The weapon was clean and well-maintained, with a full 30-round magazine and 2 additional magazines taped to the stock. Someone had attached a bipod to the front of the rifle, suggesting it had been configured for precision shooting. The scope is zeroed for 300 meters, Morrison said as he prepared to move to the north flank. Remember your breathing and trigger control. Make every shot count. As Morrison moved away, Maria found herself alone with the wounded soldiers and a rifle she had never wanted to fire in anger. She checked the weapon's safety and confirmed that a round was chambered, then looked through the telescopic sight toward the enemy positions on the ridgeline. The falling snow created a surreal landscape of white and gray, with dark figures occasionally visible as they moved between cover positions. Through the scope, she could see muzzle flashes from enemy weapons, bright orange blooms in the monochrome winter scene. Santos, Kim whispered from his position behind the vehicle. There's a sniper about 400 meters up the main ridge. He's been taking shots at anyone who moves. I think he's the one who got Rodriguez. Maria adjusted the scope and scanned the rocky outcropping where Kim was pointing. After several minutes of careful observation, she spotted a figure in white camouflage partially concealed behind a large boulder. The enemy sniper was methodically firing at their position, his shots carefully aimed and spaced. She had never shot at another human being, but she understood that this sniper represented an immediate threat to her wounded patients. Every shot he fired increased the chances that more of her teammates would need medical attention she couldn't provide. The rifle scope brought the enemy sniper into sharp focus. She could see his face partially obscured by a white balaclava, his eyes focused through his own telescopic sight. He was probably trying to line up a shot at one of her teammates, waiting for someone to expose themselves long enough for a clean kill. Maria remembered her rifle training from basic combat training and advanced individual training. Breath control was essential for accurate shooting, especially at long range. She needed to time her shot for the natural pause between heartbeats, when her body was most stable. The enemy sniper was approximately 400 meters away and elevated about 200 meters above their position. She would need to compensate for both distance and the downward angle, plus factor in the wind that was blowing steadily from the west. Her hands were steady as she adjusted the rifle's position, using the bipod to create a stable shooting platform. Through the scope, she could see the enemy sniper preparing to take another shot, his rifle aimed toward the north flank where her teammates were engaged with the flanking force. Maria took a deep breath, released half of it, and began applying steady pressure to the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder as the round fired, and she immediately worked the bolt to chamber another cartridge while keeping the scope focused on the target area. The enemy sniper lurched backward and disappeared behind the boulder. Maria couldn't tell if she had hit him or if he had simply taken cover, but his rifle fire stopped completely. She continued watching the position for several minutes, but he did not reappear. Nice shot, Kim said with admiration. That guy had been making our lives miserable for the last hour. Maria felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and revulsion. She had possibly killed another human being, something that went against every instinct she had developed as a medical professional. But she had also eliminated a threat that could have killed more of her patients. The gunfire from the north flank was intensifying as the enemy fighters pressed their flanking attack. She could hear Morrison's voice over the radio, coordinating the defense and calling for ammunition reports. The responses were not encouraging. Davis is down to his last magazine, Chen reported. I've got maybe 20 rounds left. Copy that, Morrison replied grimly. Everyone conserve ammunition and make your shots count. Help is still hours away. Maria realized that her single shot had probably accomplished more than she could have achieved with her entire medical kit. By eliminating the enemy sniper, she had reduced the immediate threat to her wounded patients and her teammates. But the larger tactical situation remained desperate. She continued scanning the ridgeline through her rifle scope, looking for other enemy positions. The falling snow made observation difficult, but she could occasionally spot muzzle flashes or movement among the rocks. Each time she identified a target, she carefully aimed and fired, using the precision shooting techniques she had learned in training. After her fourth shot, she noticed that the volume of enemy fire was decreasing. The surviving fighters were becoming more cautious about exposing themselves, knowing that someone in the American position had the skill and equipment to engage them at long range. Santos, Morrison's voice came over the radio. I don't know what you're doing over there, but keep it up. The pressure on our north flank is starting to ease. She continued her methodical engagement of enemy positions, firing only when she had a clear target and a high probability of success. Each shot represented precious ammunition that couldn't be wasted on low-percentage targets. The combination of increasing snowfall and decreasing enemy fire created an opportunity that Morrison was quick to recognize. He began repositioning his soldiers to create overlapping fields of fire while conserving ammunition for the critical moments when the enemy made their final assault. Maria checked on her patients between shots. Rodriguez was still unconscious but stable, while Kim had recovered enough to provide security for their immediate area with his sidearm. Both soldiers were benefiting from the reduced enemy fire that her rifle work had helped achieve. As the afternoon wore on, the snowstorm continued to intensify. Visibility dropped to less than 30 meters, creating a white world where shapes appeared and disappeared like ghosts. The enemy fighters were finding it increasingly difficult to coordinate their attacks, while the American soldiers used the concealment to improve their defensive positions. Santos, Kim said during a brief lull in the fighting. I never thought I'd see our medic become our best sniper. Maria didn't respond immediately. She was watching a section of the ridgeline where she had seen movement several minutes earlier. The enemy fighters were adapting to her presence by moving more carefully and using better concealment, but they were still trying to maintain their attack. Through her scope, she caught a glimpse of white camouflage moving between rocks about 350 meters away. The figure was exposed for only a few seconds, but it was enough for her to estimate his position and trajectory. She led the target slightly to compensate for his movement and fired. The figure stumbled and fell behind cover, though she couldn't determine the extent of her success. What mattered was that the enemy fighters were now forced to move with extreme caution, reducing their effectiveness significantly. The radio crackled with Morrison's voice. All stations, ammunition status report. The responses confirmed what Maria had feared. Her teammates were down to their last few magazines, with some soldiers having fewer than 10 rounds remaining. When those bullets were gone, they would be reduced to fighting with pistols and improvised weapons. But something had changed in the tactical situation. The enemy fire had become sporadic and poorly coordinated, suggesting that her precision shooting had disrupted their attack plan. The fighters who remained were clearly more cautious about exposing themselves to her rifle. Movement to the east, Chen reported. Looks like some of them are pulling back. Maria shifted her scope to observe the eastern approaches and confirmed Chen's report. Several figures in white camouflage were moving away from their position, apparently withdrawing to more distant positions. Her sustained, accurate fire had convinced them that the cost of continuing the attack was too high. But the immediate crisis was far from over. Rodriguez needed evacuation to a proper medical facility. The weather was continuing to deteriorate, and they still had limited ammunition for any renewed enemy attacks. The enemy withdrawal might be temporary, giving the fighters time to bring up reinforcements or heavier weapons. Morrison crawled back to Maria's position, his face showing the strain of the prolonged firefight. Outstanding work with that rifle. You probably saved all our lives. I'm a medic, she replied, though the words carried less conviction than they had earlier in the day. Today you're whatever we need you to be, Morrison said. And, right now, we need you to be our guardian angel with a rifle. Maria looked through her scope one more time, scanning for any remaining enemy positions. The snowfall was now so heavy that visibility was limited to just a few dozen meters, creating a white sanctuary that provided protection for her wounded patients. She had crossed a line that she never expected to cross, using the same hands that saved lives to take them. But, in this frozen mountain pass, with her patients depending on her and her teammates running out of ammunition, she had discovered that sometimes the best way to preserve life was to eliminate the threats against it. The rifle felt more familiar now, no longer the foreign object it had been when she first picked it up. She had proven to herself and her teammates that when circumstances demanded it, she could be both healer and protector. As the enemy fighters continued their withdrawal and the snowstorm provided increasing concealment, Maria began to believe that they might survive this winter ambush after all. Hashtag the price of survival. The blizzard had transformed the mountain pass into a white fortress of silence. Maria Santos lay prone behind the armored vehicle, her rifle scope scanning through the swirling snow for any sign of enemy movement. 3 hours had passed since the last confirmed enemy contact, but she knew better than to assume the threat had completely disappeared. Rodriguez stirred behind her, the first sign of consciousness he had shown since losing massive amounts of blood. Maria immediately crawled to his side, setting her rifle carefully within reach while she checked his vital signs. His pulse was weak but steady, and his breathing had stabilized thanks to the 4 fluids she had administered. "Where am I?" Rodriguez asked weakly, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "You're safe," Maria assured him, adjusting the thermal blanket that protected him from the extreme cold. "You took a bullet to the leg, but you're going to be fine. Just stay still, and let me take care of you." Rodriguez tried to sit up, but immediately grimaced in pain. "The others? Are they okay?" "Everyone's alive," Maria said, which was technically true, though several soldiers had minor injuries from flying debris and ricochet fragments. Kim got hit in the shoulder, but he's doing well. The enemy pulled back when the snow got heavy. What she didn't tell Rodriguez was that their situation remained critical. They were still trapped on the mountain road with limited ammunition, deteriorating weather conditions, and no immediate prospect of evacuation. The enemy fighters had withdrawn, but whether that was a tactical retreat or a preparation for a renewed attack remained unknown. Morrison appeared through the swirling snow, his white camouflage making him nearly invisible until he was just a few feet away. "How's Rodriguez?" "Conscious and stable," Maria reported. "His blood pressure is improving, but he still needs proper medical facilities as soon as possible." Morrison nodded, then looked at the rifle lying beside her medical equipment. "Any more contact since the last shots?" "Nothing confirmed. I thought I saw movement about an hour ago, but it could have been wind blowing snow around the rocks. Visibility is too poor for effective observation beyond 50 meters. The Weather Service is calling this the worst blizzard in the region for over a decade," Morrison said grimly. Even if the enemy wanted to continue their attack, they'd have trouble coordinating in these conditions. Maria understood the implications. While the weather provided protection from enemy action, it also prevented any possibility of evacuation or resupply. They were completely on their own until the storm passed, which could be days rather than hours. Kim crawled over to their position, moving carefully to avoid aggravating his shoulder wound. Despite his injury, he had been maintaining security and helping with minor tasks that didn't require the use of both arms. "Sergeant, I've been monitoring the radio. Mountain Base is reporting 0 visibility and winds over 60 miles per hour. All aircraft are grounded indefinitely." The 3 soldiers looked at each other, understanding that they were facing a survival situation rather than just a tactical problem. They had food for perhaps 2 days, limited medical supplies, and no shelter other than their vehicles. If the storm continued much longer, exposure and hypothermia would become as dangerous as enemy bullets. "We need to establish a proper shelter," Morrison decided. "Santos, how mobile is Rodriguez?" Maria assessed her patient's condition carefully. Moving him would be risky, but staying exposed to the elements would be fatal. "He can't walk, but we could carry him if we're careful. The bleeding has stopped, and his condition is stable enough for short-distance movement." Morrison began planning their survival strategy. The fallen tree that had initially trapped them could now provide the foundation for a shelter. Combined with materials from their vehicles and equipment, they could create a wind-resistant structure that would protect them from the worst of the storm. As the soldiers began gathering materials for their improvised shelter, Maria continued monitoring both of her patients while maintaining security with her rifle. The enemy fighters might have withdrawn, but wild animals were also a threat in this remote mountain region, especially during severe weather when their normal food sources were inaccessible. The work proceeded slowly in the extreme conditions. Every task took twice as long as normal when performed while wearing heavy winter gloves and fighting against wind that threatened to knock them off their feet. Maria found herself moving between medical duties, construction work, and security responsibilities as the team adapted to their situation. Chun and Davis had managed to create a basic framework using branches from the fallen tree and equipment from their vehicles. The structure wasn't large, but it would provide enough space for all 6 soldiers to shelter together while sharing body heat and conserving energy. Santos, Morrison called out over the wind. We need you to make some medical decisions. She secured her rifle and crawled over to where Morrison was kneeling beside a pile of medical supplies. He had gathered everything from individual first aid kits, medication from their survival gear, and the remaining contents of her medic bag. We might be here for several days, Morrison said. I need to know how to ration these supplies and what we should expect if Rodriguez's condition changes. Maria mentally calculated their medical resources against the potential duration of their isolation. Rodriguez should remain stable as long as we can keep him warm and hydrated. Kim's wound is healing well and shouldn't require much additional treatment. Our biggest risks are hypothermia and dehydration. She organized the medical supplies into categories: emergency trauma treatment, pain management, infection prevention, and survival medications. With careful rationing, they had enough supplies to treat minor injuries and illnesses for about a week. But there was another consideration that Morrison hadn't mentioned directly. If the enemy fighters returned with reinforcements, there would likely be additional casualties that would quickly exhaust their medical supplies. Maria had proven she could use a rifle effectively, but sustained combat would inevitably result in wounded soldiers. As darkness began to fall, the temperature dropped even further. The wind chill was approaching 50 degrees below zero, cold enough to cause frostbite within minutes of exposure. Their improvised shelter became not just convenient, but essential for survival. The 6 soldiers crowded into the small space, sharing thermal blankets and body heat while taking turns maintaining security watches. Maria positioned herself where she could monitor both patients while keeping her rifle within easy reach. Santos, Rodriguez said quietly as she checked his pulse. Thank you for saving my life back there. That's what medics do, she replied, though she knew that what she had done went far beyond normal medical duties. I heard about your shooting, Rodriguez continued. Kim told me you took out at least 4 enemy fighters with that rifle. That's not what medics usually do. Maria didn't respond immediately. She had been wrestling with the moral implications of her actions throughout the afternoon. As a medic, she had taken an oath to preserve life and avoid harm. But the enemy fighters had been trying to kill her patients, and stopping them had required lethal force. Sometimes we have to do things we never expected, she finally said. Sometimes being a medic means protecting your patients from threats that medicine can't fix. Kim, who had been listening to their conversation, spoke up. You saved all of us. Not just with medical treatment, but by stopping the enemy attack. I've never seen shooting like that. Morrison, who was monitoring the radio for any communications, looked over at Maria. When we get back to base, there's going to be some serious recognition for what you did today. You went above and beyond anything expected of a combat medic. Maria felt uncomfortable with the praise. She had done what seemed necessary at the time, but the memory of looking through her rifle scope at human targets would stay with her forever. Each shot had been carefully aimed and deliberately fired, making her actions very different from the reflexive self-defense that soldiers were trained for. As the night progressed, the soldiers took turns on security watch while the others tried to rest. The storm continued unabated, with wind that shook their improvised shelter and snow that accumulated steadily around their position. During her security watch, Maria scanned the surrounding area through her rifle scope, using the weapon's night vision capabilities to penetrate the darkness. The green-tinted world revealed only blowing snow and ice-covered rocks, with no sign of enemy activity. But she remained alert, knowing that desperate people sometimes made desperate decisions. The enemy fighters might attempt to continue their attack despite the weather, hoping to catch the Americans off guard during the storm. Her rifle had become their primary defensive weapon, and she was now their most experienced long-range shooter. As dawn approached, the storm began to show signs of weakening. The wind decreased from a howling gale to merely strong gusts, and the horizontal snow changed to heavy but manageable snowfall. Visibility improved enough to see perhaps 100 meters in most directions. Morrison immediately got on the radio to re-establish contact with Mountain Base. After several attempts, he managed to get through the static and interference caused by the storm. Mountain Base, this is Bravo Team. We're alive and holding position, but we need immediate medical evacuation for one critical patient. The radio crackled with the voice of their command post. Bravo Team, we've been trying to reach you for 18 hours. What's your status? Morrison provided a brief summary of their tactical situation and casualties while Maria continued monitoring Rodriguez's condition. The wounded soldier was stable but needed proper medical facilities to prevent complications from his injuries. Bravo Team, weather is improving but still too dangerous for helicopter operations. Ground reinforcement is being organized, but it will take at least 6 hours to reach your position due to road conditions. Maria looked at Rodriguez, calculating whether he could survive another 6 hours in their improvised shelter. His condition was stable, but the combination of blood loss, extreme cold, and stress was taking a cumulative toll on his body. We can keep him stable for 6 hours, she told Morrison. But after that, we're going to need real medical facilities. As the morning progressed, the weather continued to improve gradually. The snowfall decreased to light flurries, and the wind calmed enough to allow normal conversation without shouting. Most importantly, visibility increased to several hundred meters, allowing effective observation of their surroundings. Maria resumed her security duties with the rifle, scanning the approaches to their position for any sign of enemy activity. The fresh snow would make it easy to spot tracks or movement, but it would also slow down any potential attackers. Around midday, she spotted movement on the main road about half a mile away. Through her rifle scope, she could see a convoy of military vehicles working their way through the snow drifts toward their position. The reinforcements had arrived earlier than expected. Contact on the road, she reported to Morrison. Friendly vehicles, looks like a full convoy. Morrison confirmed the identification through his binoculars and radio communications. Within an hour, a relief force of 20 soldiers with medical personnel and equipment had reached their position. Rodriguez was immediately prepared for evacuation, while Kim received proper medical attention for his shoulder wound. The commanding officer of the relief force, Captain Williams, spoke privately with Morrison about the engagement. Maria could see them examining the enemy positions on the ridgeline and discussing the tactical situation that had developed during the ambush. After completing the evacuation preparations, Captain Williams approached Maria directly. Staff Sergeant Santos, I understand you played a critical role in defending this position. I did my job, Maria replied simply. According to Sergeant Morrison's report, you eliminated at least 4 enemy combatants with precision rifle fire while simultaneously providing medical treatment to 2 critically wounded soldiers. That's extraordinary performance under extreme conditions. Maria looked up at the ridgeline where she had engaged the enemy fighters. In the clear daylight, she could see bloodstains in the snow near several of the positions she had targeted, confirming the effectiveness of her shooting. Sir, I'm a medic. Yesterday, I had to become something else to protect my patients. I hope I never have to do that again. Captain Williams studied her carefully. Sergeant Santos, sometimes the best medics are those who understand that healing and protecting are 2 aspects of the same mission. What you did here will save lives in the future by showing other medics what's possible when circumstances demand it. As the convoy prepared to leave the mountain pass, Maria took one last look at the position where they had fought for survival. The fallen tree was still there, along with their improvised shelter and the scattered equipment they were leaving behind. Bloodstains in the snow marked where Rodriguez had fallen and where she had treated his wounds. But what she would remember most was the moment when she had to choose between remaining purely a medic and becoming something more complex. In that choice, she had discovered that sometimes the most compassionate action was the most violent one. The convoy began its journey back to base, carrying wounded soldiers who were alive because of her medical skills and her rifle skills. Rodriguez was stable and would make a full recovery. Kim's shoulder wound was healing properly. The mission that had seemed doomed to failure had become a success story. As they drove away from the mountain pass, Maria cleaned her rifle and returned it to the soldier who had originally carried it. She had used the weapon to save lives, but she hoped never to need it again. She was, above all else, a medic whose hands were trained to heal. But she now knew that when healing wasn't enough, those same hands could hold steel with deadly precision. In the mountains of Afghanistan, she had learned that sometimes the best way to preserve life was to eliminate the threats against it, even if that meant becoming something she had never wanted to be. The price of survival had been higher than she expected, but her patients were alive, her teammates were safe, and she had proven that a medic's oath to preserve life sometimes required taking it. In the end, that was a price she was willing to pay.